Hopefully I'm not going to kick any children or drop any Bibles for the next few minutes. So, where are we? We're in the Sermon on the Mount, and we've been doing this series since back in May. And so as we begin, as much for myself as for you, because I did the first one and I don't think I've heard any more in the series since, I thought taking us right back to where we began might be a good way to start this morning. So that Sunday morning, we began by looking at the end of Jesus' sermon and thinking about what his conclusion was. And the aim through that message was that everything that we said on that Sunday would feed its way back into every week following. And if you remember rightly, or if you don't, just turn over the page in your Bible to Matthew chapter 8. Jesus ends, at the end of chapter 7, Jesus ends his sermon with the very famous illustration of two builders building two houses in two really similar locations. They both are hit by a storm, and then we see the aftermath of the story. One house stands, the other one just collapses. And Jesus told this story to represent how life can work out. That we can all go through things, we can all face things that life throws at us, but whether we stand or whether we fall depends on something. It depends on not whether we hear Jesus' words or whether we don't. It depends upon whether we hear them and put them into practice, or whether we hear them and don't put them into practice. We're all going to be on a collision course with storms, and the way we stand is we hear what Jesus says and we put it into practice. And so when we began this series, one of the things I think I said was this, that as we look in detail at Jesus' words over the weeks following, about how we're to be truthful, how we're to deal with our anger, how we're to forgive, what we're to do with our money, as we looked at all of these various things, at various stages, Jesus was going to be taking us to the limits of our obedience in following him. And he was going to be asking us to take a step beyond what we know and to trust him. So that's why one of the songs that has been sung, I think, a number of times through this series is the song Oceans, because it says, "Spirit, take me where my faith is without borders." So take me where I am uncomfortable. We want to be people whose faith doesn't have a border. We don't say to Jesus, "I will obey you this far, and even though I know you're saying go a bit further, I'm not going to go there." We want to be people who obey all the way through. And so this morning, our passage is going to do exactly the same thing to us. With regard to our relationships, as Ed so very helpfully said, it's going to take us to the edge of our obedience, where Jesus says what we're supposed to do, and we're tempted to say, "No, I don't fancy doing that, actually." It's going to take us right there, and we're going to, again, be left with the choice, do I do what Jesus says, even though it's difficult, or do I not? Do I hear Jesus' words and put them into practice, or do I not? And so, as we think about our relationships with people, this passage adds another layer to it. If everything Jesus has said is going to take us to the borders of our faith, this one, it kind of tells us to walk a tightrope as well. Because in everything that Jesus says, and specifically when we can see things wrong in people's lives, we'll see there are two ways we can be imbalanced on how we deal with people. Two ways of getting it wrong, often without even realizing it. And so we're going to have to learn that with regard to how we deal with people, we have to walk a tightrope at times. Different people, we respond to in different ways. There's not a cookie-cutter way of dealing with relationships, so in every situation you know exactly what to do. People are different, situations are different, how we deal with them is different. And as we work through what it means to not judge, we're all going to be challenged in one way or another, all of us. For some of us, God is going to say this. He's going to say, in your relationships with people, you think you are loving, consider whether you're actually just being a coward and you don't really care for people. He's going to say that. For others, he's going to say, you think you're loving, but consider whether you're just abrasive and you like an argument. He's going to be saying these kind of things. So let's look at the passage together. And as we begin, this is one of those often quoted and often misquoted parts of the Bible. This passage is full of things which are actually should be quite funny when we think about them. And when we put these things together, the comic elements and the bits that we might not understand, we can really get to what Jesus is saying. So one of the funny bits is you have a picture of someone with a plank sticking out of their face saying, "Let me get the splinter out of your eye." That's supposed to make us think that's just ridiculous. You have Jesus saying, "Don't judge anyone," and then a few verses later he calls people dogs. When you put these things together, you can kind of work out what he's saying. So, let's go. Let's look at verses 1 and 2 to start with, where it says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." Now, if you're one of those people who ever has the misfortune of reading anything on the internet where people are having an argument about how people should behave, if a Christian is ever involved in that discussion, inevitably, at some stage, someone will put out the phrase, "How dare you judge me?" And they might even post one of these lovely little statements to back up their statement, like, "Before you judge me, make sure you're perfect." Don't judge people for the choices they make when you don't know the options they had to choose from. Judging a person does not define who they are, it defines who you are, which that one actually judges the person. But I just find that strange. People will say, you can't judge people, you can't make a comment about their lives, you can't do those things. So, is Jesus saying that? Is he saying you can't evaluate someone's life? I don't think he is. He isn't using it in that way at all. We know that words have a range of meanings. So judge, it's one of those words. There's a range of ways you can understand it. You can judge whether something is a good idea or not. You evaluate it. You work out whether it's a wise decision. So when we were on holiday and Noah wanted to go on every single roller coaster that he saw, I had to make a judgment as to whether it was a good idea or not. More often than not, I judged, no, I don't fancy going on that roller coaster. But my judgments were irrelevant because he wanted to. The theme parks all said they had to have an adult with them, and Lorna can play the "I've had major back surgery" card. So I had to go on them all. And for the under 40s in the room, there's something that happens at around 40 years of age where anything that spins you around just makes you feel sick. Even the most tame of rides, they just become horrible. We know Jesus isn't saying don't evaluate. We know he's not saying that because in verse 6, he evaluates people. He calls them dogs and he calls them pigs. So what does he mean when he says don't judge? He means this: don't put yourself in the place of God. Don't put yourself into a position where you pronounce judgment on other people, where you pronounce sentence on them, and you enjoy pronouncing sentence on them. And we can do that really easily. We can do that without even realizing it. I know I've shared this before, but it's another example of one of those things people post online which drives me mad. So you would quite often see this phrase go up: karma, no need for revenge, just sit back and wait. Those who hurt you will eventually screw up themselves, and if you're lucky, God will let you watch. If you post that, you're actually saying, I want that person's life to go badly. You have pronounced sentence on them. You've judged them. Without even realizing it, you've said they deserve something. In your heart, if you're a person who judges, you're saying that person's life is going to go wrong, it needs to go wrong, and it deserves to go wrong. That's what Jesus means. When Jesus is saying don't judge, it's probably the case he's thinking one day God is going to come back and he's going to judge the earth. That's not your job. That's not your job. So for us, that means things like this. Don't condemn people to their face with words like this. Don't ever say to someone, you will never change, or you've ruined your life, or you can't possibly be a Christian if you do that. Don't write people off in your minds. Don't ever be judge, jury, and executioner. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying you can evaluate someone's actions, but you can't ever pronounce sentence on them. That's what he's saying. And that, I think, makes sense of what he's saying, and it's part of the tightrope we have to walk. We have to have to evaluate people, but we can't pronounce sentence on them. And if we can evaluate how people are living their lives, and if we're supposed to be a loving community of people who look out for one another, that means something. If we see someone going wrong, we're supposed to get involved. We're supposed to get involved. So we're supposed to speak the truth to one another in love. We're supposed to do what it says on the screen there. If you see someone caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. You're supposed to get involved. In James 5, it says that if someone wanders from the truth, that we should bring them back and save them and cover over a multitude of sins. So if you can evaluate people, which you can, and you see someone going wrong, you've got the responsibility to do something about it. So how do we do that? Because that's a really difficult path to walk. Well, I think Jesus teaching about the plank and the speck is really, really important. But before we go there, if we do accept that, yes, we do have a responsibility to speak to people, then maybe for some of us, the borders of our obedience is found right there. We're called to get involved, but some of us hate doing that. Some of us hate doing that. And I know what that's like. Sometimes we see someone who we really care about making an unwise decision, and we think something like this: I love them. I don't want to say anything to them that might hurt them. So I'm either going to keep quiet or I'll support them in this. I won't challenge them. I won't jeopardize my friendship with them. I'll care for them. That's the path some of us walk. And then we sit in that tension. We know it isn't right, but we don't open our mouths. We know someone's going down a bad path, but we don't say anything to them. And we tell ourselves it's because we love them and we're called to be peacemakers, when the truth is we're probably just too scared to do what God calls us to do. For some of us, we think we're being loving, but we're just being cowards. And actually, the Bible would put it more starkly than I've just done. So back in the book of Proverbs, there's this verse which says this: faithful or wounds from a friend can be trusted. And what that means is this, that if someone you know loves you, if they challenge you and they say to you, you're doing this, whatever it might be, and it's wrong and it's going to damage you, even though it might hurt you, you have to look at it and say, I know they care about me, so this is probably right. It might hurt you, it might wound you, you might initially feel all kinds of anger towards that person and not want anything to do with them for a while. But if you know they love you, then that wound is for your good. And you should reflect on whether they're right or not. Sometimes being a loving friend means you risk the friendship. Sometimes being a loving friend means you risk the friendship. And that verse in Proverbs, there's another half to it, which is probably the more chilling half to it, which says this: it says those words, an enemy multiplies kisses. So if you have a tendency to shy away from hard conversations, that should really hit you. And that's a verse that hits me because I tend to shy away from hard conversations. But what the Bible is saying to me is this: if I do that, then I'm effectively someone's enemy. If I don't say to them what needs to be said, and I'm the person to say it, I'm their enemy. It's quite a hard thing to hear. If you know someone who in their life puts their family and their marriage in jeopardy spiritually, socially, in every kind of way because they work too much and they spend all of their time at the office, and they come to you and they tell you about a new job which is going to be more pay but longer hours, and you say to them, brilliant, go for it, you might have just been their enemy. You might have just been their enemy. If someone embarks on a relationship which you know is going to pull them away from God, and you say to them, I'm so happy for you, you've just been their enemy. If someone comes to you and tells you how there is someone that they simply cannot stand and it's consuming them and they can't forgive, and you don't say you need to forgive them, you're an enemy who just kissed them on the face. It's really, really hard, this verse. And those examples I've just given might not resonate for you. But let me put the question this way. When did you last think that you probably needed to say something to someone, but you didn't? Maybe God wants to take you back to that moment and say, if you get another chance, take that opportunity. If that's something you need to pray about today, go home and do it. When did I last feel God prompting me to say something to someone, but I didn't want to jeopardize the friendship? Go back to that moment and pray about it. So if you can get it wrong this way, and I know that's my temptation, what's the other way you can possibly get it wrong? Well, I think there's another way we can go. We can be a person who views themselves as a straight talker, and we see someone doing something wrong and we think it needs addressing, and we go straight on in there. We barge in there. We want them to see it our way. We think we want to win the person round, but it could be we just want to win an argument. We can be abrasive with people. Whenever you confront someone or challenge them, you need to ask yourself this question: is this about them or is it about me? Am I trying to win the person or am I trying to win an argument? And if you're wired this kind of way, it could be, if it goes badly, you say to yourself, well, at least I did my bit. What Jesus says about the speck and the plank needs to come in here. So let's think about that. Those of us who need to trust God in confronting people, those of us who are quick to confront people, both need to look at this passage. Because Jesus is telling us what our heart needs to be like if we're going to challenge someone. Let's look at it. We get given this comic situation. It's really difficult to find a picture to go on a PowerPoint for this because they just all look gruesome. That was the best I could do. About a person who's got a plank in their eye and they're looking at someone with a splinter of wood in their eye and they're saying, I can get it out for you. I can get it out for you. Jesus seems to be saying, put your house in order before you even think about talking to someone else. Which he is, but he's saying something else as well. What he seems to be saying is this: sometimes we can be oblivious to the sins in our life. We don't see them. To us, they're like a tiny little splinter, but to everyone else around us, they're like a great big 2x4 sticking out of our face. Sometimes we're blind to the things that are wrong. So, for example, there might be a man who falls deeply in love with a woman who hurts him. And from that hurt, he's then bitter at all women. Not just that woman, he's bitter at all women. He's blind to it, and he needs someone to help him. Sometimes that's where we are. We need someone to help us. When I first got my contact lenses, I did something which I still do. If you're a contact lens wearer, you know that once it gets late in the day, they can get a little bit itchy, and you just want to rub them, and it feels so good. It really does feel good. The first time I wore them, I'd worn them far too long. It got dry, it got itchy, and I rubbed my eye. And for the first of many, many times, I managed to push a contact lens round the back of my eye. It's not a pleasant moment, no. And I dealt with this in my usual calm, reserved manner, as I'm sure you can imagine, for about 5 minutes. And then after 5 minutes, and because I couldn't get it out, I'm jamming my finger into my eye. I'm thinking, I can't even see where the contact lens has gone. I can feel it, but I can't find it. I'm pulling my eyelid down. I'm putting tons of water in there. It's getting progressively redder and redder and more puffy. I contemplated putting shampoo in it because I thought if I make myself cry, that'll force it out, but I stopped myself. After an hour of struggling, I decided I probably need a bit of help. And in my head, because I've seen those pictures online of what contact lens misuse can do, I'm already up here. I'm already thinking, right, I'm losing my eye. This is never coming out. I'm losing my eye. I'm thinking, eye patches, they're quite cool. I'm going to have one of them. And then I thought, I've got to get help. And in my world, that means my older sister. She's a nurse, and she'll know what to do. Poor nurses. Anyone who's got a nurse in their family, they are the person we always go to with every tiny complaint. I do that with my sister, and I turn up at her house at about 11 o'clock at night, which is always a great moment for a parent of small children. And she helps. I'm pretty sure she rolled her eyes quite a lot and muttered things under her breath. But the way she helped, and she did it in less than a minute, which was really annoying, is she came at me with a tissue to remove the contact lens, with as much care and as much compassion as she could muster for her irritating little brother. When Jesus talks about there being a plank in your eye that you need to get rid of, he's not saying sort your life out completely in every single way before you even say anything to anyone, because none of us would ever do it. He's saying you've got stuff wrong in your life too. You should be much more aware of what's wrong in your life. And from your perspective, the things that are wrong in you should look like a plank compared to the splinter in someone else's life. And then he's saying, be humbled by that and compassionately help the other person. When my sister did that and she got that contact lens out, she approached me with a tissue. If she'd come at me with a hammer or scissors or even a pair of tweezers, I would have thought twice about it. But she came gently and compassionately, even though it was 11 o'clock and I was probably irritating the life out of her. What stops us being compassionate at times is we forget how much we've been forgiven. We forget that. If we keep that in view when we're about to embark on a difficult conversation, we will be full of grace. We'll want to win the person and not the argument. We'll want them to discover what we have discovered, and being right is secondary to them becoming what they need to be. So far in this tightrope walk that we've got to walk, don't condemn, but don't say nothing. If something needs saying, say it, otherwise you're acting like an enemy. If you do say something, make sure you're full of humility and compassion and grace. It's quite difficult, isn't it? So these things. And then we hit verse 6, which says this to us. All of that stuff, apart from the times when you need to keep quiet and say nothing. Apart from those times. So verse 6, and I know some of you are thinking this is just impossible so far. How can you know what to do? We're going to come to that. So verse 6 says to us, don't give to dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they might trample them and then turn and tear you to pieces. Going back to the book of Proverbs, which we mentioned earlier, God inspired the writer of that book to give us another couple of nuggets of wisdom which help us with this. So back there it says, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be just like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. Same two verses tell us to do two completely different things. So which one is it? Sometimes one, sometimes the other. Sometimes you say something, sometimes you don't. When Jesus talks about dogs and pigs, he's deliberately using two animals which his audience would have thought of as vile and worthless and dirty. And he's saying that you don't give animals like that something that's precious. You don't give dogs sacred meat. You don't give pearls to pigs because they're going to look like nuts. They're going to try and eat them. And then when they eat the pearls and they find that they're not food, they're not going to appreciate it. He's saying that animals like that are just interested in what can feed them. And if you look like you're feeding them, so if you go to a pig and say, here, have some pearls, they want food. And if you don't provide what they offer, it's quite possible they will say this, these aren't edible, but you are, and they'll go for you. So he's now saying, when it comes to people, make a judgment call. Make a judgment call. If you're evaluating where someone is with regard to the gospel, sometimes they're going to behave like a pig with it, and they're going to throw it back in your face. They aren't ready to hear it, they can't hear it, and if you push, and if you push, and if you push, eventually they're going to bite back. He's saying that. Recently, as some of you know, we spent some time in Florida, and whilst we were there, in one of the parks was this precious little creature. Precious, lovely little creature. And Laurie, who I know is known to some of you, she thought, oh, that's a beautiful little squirrel. I'm going to feed it. That's what she decided to do. She tried to feed it, she tried to befriend it, and it bit her. Yeah, there's a picture. That's her with her bleeding finger. We've also got this on video. It's brilliant. Laurie got bit. Whose fault was it? Laurie's fault. It was Laurie's fault she got bit. It wasn't the squirrel's fault. It was just doing what squirrels do. She had food. It wanted the food. It bit her. It was just acting in line with its nature. Jesus is saying to us here, when it comes to sharing the gospel and sharing what's precious with people, some people just aren't ready to hear it. They're just not ready. And if that's what their reaction shows itself to be, don't push it, because you might get bitten. There's a saying, don't teach a pig to sing. It will only wear you out and annoy the pig. Sometimes that's just how life has got to work. And this is a tough judgment call to make, but it's one we do. I know of someone, and this is my dad, who when he was in the Navy and he came home on leave, and he'd been having ridiculously long shifts, he would come home and he would try to recover at home, and his mother would play sermons to him on a cassette recorder outside his door at 7 o'clock in the morning. He kicked a lot of cassette recorders down the stairs because he wasn't ready to hear it. With regard to the gospel, his reaction was like a pig at that point in time. He did become a follower of Jesus later. But just at that moment, it wasn't the moment to speak to him. And I know how tough this might sound, because some of you are thinking, how do you make the judgment call? And some of you might suspect you live with a pig. And it could be even worse, because with regard to the gospel, they're a pig. So they're not just a pig in terms of being a messy person. They don't listen to when you try and invite them to church. They don't listen to the gospel. This passage would say, test where people are. If they bite back at you, maybe it's not the moment. But don't give up. Don't give up. Because Jesus says, don't judge. You're not the one who ultimately says whether they're going to make it or not. You can just evaluate where they are and say, this isn't a good call now. The Apostle Paul was, with regard to the gospel at one time, he was a pig. He was a dog. He was dangerous. He bit and he tore to pieces. There's a king called Manasseh in the Old Testament who leads the people to worship idols and worship the stars and sacrifices his children and essentially does everything that God says not to do, and at the end of his life, God changes him. Just because someone's a pig one day doesn't mean they're a pig forever. So go with that. Go with that. And as we close, if all of this seems just too difficult, if you've got no idea how to navigate the relationships in your life, you've probably ended up in the right place, okay? Because that's where I think we're supposed to be. And that's what makes what Jesus says next really, really important. So if we've got to a point where we're thinking, I have no idea how to relate to people, Jesus then says, yeah, I knew you'd be thinking that. So ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. If you've got a pig living in your house and you don't know how to reach them, ask God for wisdom. Pray about them. If you've got a friend who you know's gone off track and you don't know how to start that conversation, pray about it. He's a good father. He'll give you what you want. And this verse says, keep on praying, keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. Do those things. If you're going to do anything with regard to relationships, do that first. Talk to people about God before you talk about God to people. That's probably a good bit of advice. And the last thing, see these are quick, these two, is if you're going to keep your heart in the right place, so you don't become judgmental, so you don't become a judge who pronounces sentences on people, look at the passage again. Starts off by saying, do not judge or you'll be judged. There was someone who was judged for you. You do have a plank in your eye. There was someone who took a plank and carried it to a hill. We were all dogs and pigs with regard to the gospel at some point, and we we kind of trampled all over Jesus and he let us. And despite these things, we've got a God who looked on us and said, I'm going to make them my children. They're dogs, but I'm going to make them my children. So if we've been turned around, God can turn anyone around. If we've received mercy, we need to be merciful. Let's not give up on people. Let's not be judges. Let's have hard conversations. And let's always talk to God about people. Let's pray. Father God, when we think about what the Bible teaches us about relationships, maybe it's less of a tightrope and more of a minefield, that we don't quite know when we're supposed to say something. We don't know when to confront something that's wrong or when to be quiet. We don't always know what's even going on in our own lives. We can have a plank sticking out of our eye and be completely oblivious to it. And so we would ask this, that you'd give us wisdom. That if we have a tendency to be cowardly in our relationships, you would make us brave for you. If we have a tendency to just like to win an argument, you'd soften us and make us compassionate. We would ask that we would be people who don't pronounce sentence on another, but we do recognize when someone's doing something wrong. And we ask that in all of our relationships, we wouldn't just rush in, but we would spend time with you talking about people. So if we live with someone and we think they're never going to change, they're never going to come to Christ, we'd spend time talking with you about them. If we think someone is a pig with regard to the gospel, we'd talk to you about them and ask for your wisdom. Father, help us, because that's the thing we know that we should do, which we don't always do brilliantly. We don't talk to you about people as much as we should. We talk about ourselves, we talk about the things that we want, but we don't always lay people before you. So we ask this, that if there's someone on our heart, that you'd give us the wisdom of knowing what to do. If there's someone we need to have a hard conversation with, give us the bravery to do it. But keep us compassionate, keep us loving, keep us looking to Christ. And we ask this all in his name. Amen.